American paratroopers of the 2nd Battalion, 173rd Airborne Brigade, crossing a river with automatic weapons raised to keep them dry in the jungle of Ben Cat. This operation, which lasted 12 days, was part of a larger U.S. effort to locate and combat the Viet Cong. However, during this specific operation, there were no direct encounters with the enemy. The absence of direct combat did not diminish the mission's importance, as it was part of an ongoing effort to patrol and dominate enemy-controlled areas, maintaining pressure on Viet Cong forces and disrupting their logistical and communication operations. About 130 South Vietnamese soldiers were caught in a heavy monsoon rain while navigating small boats called sampans in the Mekong Delta. They were on their way to a dawn attack on a Viet Cong guerrilla camp located 13 miles northeast of Can Tho, an important city in the region. The operation resulted in several Viet Cong guerrillas being killed or wounded. The Tet Offensive was a coordinated attack where Viet Cong fighters executed a surprisingly bold action by invading the United States Embassy compound in Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City. They managed to control part of the compound for approximately 6 hours. During this time, intense fighting occurred, and many soldiers on both sides were wounded or killed. Eventually, the invaders were either eliminated or captured by American forces. Although it did not result in a decisive military victory for the Viet Cong, the attack demonstrated that the insurgents could hit highly protected targets, challenging the notion that the war was under control. The Cambodian incursion took place when American forces, including the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, crossed the border into Cambodia. President Richard Nixon ordered this operation to attack and destroy hideouts used by enemy forces. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had established complex tunnel networks and supply depots in Cambodia, taking advantage of the country's neutrality to shelter from American bombings. The incursion involved about 30,000 American and South Vietnamese soldiers who penetrated deep into Cambodian territory in search of hideouts and weapons depots. President Richard Nixon made an announcement at the White House, revealing that he had ordered American troops to attack communist positions in Cambodia. This was a significant development in the conflict, as it represented the expansion of the war beyond Vietnam. The attack generated protests and controversies in the country, as many Americans were weary of the prolonged conflict in Vietnam and saw the expansion into Cambodia as a sign of escalation. On March 17, 1968, about 10,000 demonstrators gathered in Grosvenor Square, London, in front of the American Embassy to protest against the war. There were clashes between police and demonstrators who demanded an end to U.S. involvement in the Vietnam conflict. The demonstration of discontent was marked by tensions, resulting in numerous arrests. The episode was a reflection of the growing global resistance against the war and played a crucial role in strengthening the anti-war movement, influencing public opinion. During the march against the Vietnam conflict, figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Dr. Benjamin Spock, an influential pediatrician, led the parade on State Street in Chicago. This protest was part of many national efforts to express public discontent with the conflict. Martin Luther King was a vocal opponent of the war, criticizing the disproportionate impact of the conflict on African American and poor communities. Coordinated by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, the Tet Offensive targeted several cities and villages, including the capital Saigon. The intense clashes between Viet Cong forces and American forces devastated an entire neighborhood of Saigon. The offensive began during the Lunar New Year holiday, a time when many expected a temporary ceasefire. The surprise attack included the use of rockets and grenades, which caused not only massive building destruction, but also severe fires that spread quickly. Besides the material damage, the human impact was devastating, with numerous civilian and combatant casualties. The fires resulting from the attacks further increased the chaos and destruction, leaving many homeless. A tragic event occurred at Kent State University in Ohio during a protest against the war. National Guard members opened fire on students gathered on campus. 4 young people were killed and 9 others were wounded. This violent action generated shock and outrage across the country, intensifying debates about the conflict and the government's role in managing protests. Members of SEAL Team 1, a Navy Special Operations team, conducted operations along the Bassac River in southern Vietnam near Saigon. Using assault boats, these highly trained soldiers had the mission to disrupt the supply and communication routes of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army forces. Navigating the narrow, densely vegetated waters of the Bassac River, SEAL Team 1 carried out reconnaissance missions, ambushes, and direct attacks. Their operations were essential in destabilizing enemy activities and preventing the flow of military supplies, crucial for the communist resistance in the region. In a battle in the Puoc Vinh area, northeast of Saigon, American soldiers found themselves in a tense and dangerous situation. They were searching for hidden Viet Cong snipers while taking cover in muddy bomb craters. These craters, the result of intense aerial bombings, offered some cover but also evidenced the widespread destruction of the war. Battles like this were characterized by ambushes, surprise attacks, and a constant search for enemy combatants hidden in the dense jungle and difficult terrain. The conflict in Phuoc Vinh, like many others, continued for years with high costs in human lives and resources. Under-Secretary of State Nicholas Katzenbach testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1967. Katzenbach emphatically argued that revoking the legislative support that allowed American military actions in South Vietnam would put President Lyndon Johnson and the country in an extremely difficult position. This legislative support, known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, had been approved in 1964 and granted the president broad powers to conduct military operations in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The revocation of this resolution, according to Katzenbach, could weaken the United States' position in the conflict and send a message of lack of commitment to allies and enemies. General William Westmoreland, talking with soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 16th Regiment of the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Division of the U.S. This meeting took place near Bien Hoa, a key area in Vietnam. General Westmoreland was known for his attrition strategy, which aimed to inflict maximum casualties on enemy forces to weaken their fighting capacity. His visits to troops in the field were part of his efforts to assess combat conditions and boost soldiers' morale. On February 9, 1966, in Washington, members of the organization Women's Strike for Peace protested in front of the White House. They demonstrated against the increased U.S. involvement in the war. The participants, who came mainly from East Coast cities, used symbols such as white paper doves and black helium balloons bearing the message, "Stop the killing." Pacifist movements and growing public opposition to the war influenced public opinion and increased pressure on the government to reduce military involvement. The Red River Delta, located in northern Vietnam, was the scene of intense conflicts in 1954 during the First Indochina War. Young guerrillas, equipped with grenades strapped to their belts, prepared to face Viet Minh forces fighting for the country's independence from French control. This confrontation was part of a larger event known as the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, culminating in the defeat of French colonial forces and contributing to the end of French rule in the region. The impact was profound, leading to the division of Vietnam into North and South and setting the stage for future conflicts in the area. French paratroopers were sent to defend the fort at Dien Bien Phu, but the favorable position of the Viet Minh, led by General Vo Nguyen Giap, and their guerrilla tactics, resulted in a Vietnamese victory after an intense siege that lasted from March to May 1954. The battle was decisive in the fight for Vietnam's independence. The French, believing they could control the region and cut Viet Minh supply lines, established a fortress in a valley surrounded by hills. However, the Viet Minh encircled the fortress with heavy artillery strategically placed in the surrounding hills, allowing continuous and precise attacks on French positions. Despite fierce resistance and reinforcement efforts by the French paratroopers, Viet Minh forces managed to encircle and isolate the French garrison, eventually forcing it to surrender on May 7, 1954. The Palais des Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, was the scene of the signing of the Indochina Truce Agreements. These agreements ended intense conflicts in Indochina, involving France, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, after years of war. Leaders and delegations from these nations, including the Soviet Union and the United States, gathered on this historic day. The agreements helped establish temporary peace in the region, facilitating future negotiations for the independence of countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The photograph is of General Vo Nguyen Giap, the military leader of the Viet Minh during the First Indochina War. He was one of Vietnam's most prominent military leaders, known for his innovative strategies and effectiveness in combat. Giap played a crucial role in the fight against French colonial forces during the First Indochina War. Under his leadership, the Viet Minh, the United Front of Vietnamese Resistance, conducted a series of successful campaigns culminating in the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu. On November 13, 1960, South Vietnam's President Ngo Dinh Diem made his first public appearance after a failed coup. The event took place on the balcony of the presidential palace in Saigon, where he waved to a crowd gathered in front of the palace. Despite the coup attempt, he remained in power for another 3 years until he was assassinated in 1963. On May 1, 1960, the United States U-2 spy plane, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down while flying over Soviet territory. Although this incident was not directly related to the Vietnam War, it intensified the atmosphere of distrust and tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, which were the superpowers involved in the conflict. The capture of Powers and his subsequent trial for espionage in Moscow heightened tensions, creating an even more volatile international environment. This impacted global relations and influenced U.S. foreign policy, including its actions in Vietnam. Soldier Bob G. Whitworth, a member of the 11th Light Infantry Brigade, was photographed after not sleeping for 3 days while fighting in the battlefields south of Da Nang. The photo captures the intensity and extreme fatigue faced by soldiers in combat. In the operation where Bob was photographed, American forces faced intense battle, resulting in the death of more than 400 enemies. Allied casualties were considered light in comparison, but the physical and mental exhaustion of the soldiers was evident. Operation Oregon was a military mission carried out near Duc Pho in Quang Ngai Province, aimed at dismantling and neutralizing enemy refugees and operations in the region, which was known to harbor strong Viet Cong presence. One notable moment of this operation involved an American soldier being carefully lowered into a tunnel, a common tactic used to explore and destabilize the complex tunnel networks built by the Viet Cong. These tunnels were used as hideouts, transport routes, weapon depots, and command centers, providing a significant strategic advantage for Communist forces. On January 15, 1968, a demonstration took place in Washington, led by former Congresswoman Jeannette Rankin. This march, led by a female brigade that included prominent participants such as Ruth Krauss, Vel Phillips, Wen Griffin, Ruth Warwick, and Lucy Montgomery, focused on protesting against the Vietnam War. During the protest, the demonstrators, carrying banners expressing their opposition to the conflict, gathered in front of the Capitol. On July 19, 1968, President Lyndon Johnson met with South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu in Honolulu at the Pacific Command headquarters. This meeting was part of ongoing discussions about the Vietnam War and peace negotiations to end the conflict, which were taking place in Paris. The war caused widespread devastation in Vietnam and created deep divisions in the United States. Eventually, Nguyen Van Thieu was forced to resign as North Vietnamese troops approached, marking a significant change in the region's history. An American soldier of the 1st Cavalry Division was seen throwing a basket of rice into the flames. This action was part of a tactic where soldiers destroyed resources to prevent them from falling into Viet Cong hands. The intention of this tactic was to weaken the enemy's resistance capacity. However, it had a devastating impact on local civilians. The rice that the soldier threw into the flames belonged to a peasant woman who was desperately trying to save it from her burning house. Fire Base Catherine, located south of the demilitarized zone that separated North and South Vietnam. In July 1970, marking one of the memorable moments of the conflict, soldiers of the 3rd Brigade, 101st Airborne Division of the United States held a rock music session, providing a moment of temporary relief amid the daily military tension. In the photo, then-President Lyndon B. Johnson and his family are observing the protests that took place in the city of Chicago. Tens of thousands of people gathered to protest against the Vietnam War during the Democratic National Convention, reflecting the growing popular dissatisfaction with the conflict. The protesters included students, civil rights activists, and war opponents. The convention and protests occurred in a highly tense atmosphere, resulting in violent clashes between protesters and the police, widely broadcast by the media. Daily press briefings, known ironically as 5 o'clock follies, took place in Saigon. These meetings, led by American military officers, aimed to inform journalists about the progress of the conflict. However, these briefings became known for the inaccuracy of the information provided, leading to criticism and skepticism from the media. Seymour Topping of the New York Times and Malcolm Brown of the Associated Press were among the journalists who attended these meetings. Sunlight filtered through the dense vegetation around the city of Binh Gia, where South Vietnamese troops, accompanied by U.S. advisors, rested after a tense night of waiting in an ambush position for a Viet Cong attack that did not happen. The area around Binh Gia was a point of Viet Cong activity, making it a strategic location for ambushes and military operations. The previous night had been marked by tension and constant vigilance, with the troops ready to respond to any enemy movement. At the White House, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was congratulated by President Richard Nixon for being one of the winners of the 1973 Nobel Peace Prize. He and North Vietnamese diplomat Le Duc Tho were jointly awarded for their efforts in negotiating an agreement to try to end the Vietnam War. Although the war only ended years later, Kissinger and Tho's peace efforts were internationally recognized through this award. On December 28, 1971, American veterans who fought in Vietnam held a symbolic protest at the Statue of Liberty. This group, known as Vietnam Veterans Against the War, occupied the site for 40 hours to express their opposition to the continuation of the conflict, especially against the increase in U.S. bombings. They raised clenched fists, a gesture of resistance and solidarity at the end of the occupation, showing their discontent with the war. The Pentagon Papers, revealed by the New York Times in 1971, detailed the government's secret strategies during the war. These documents were exposed by Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst, and published in a series of articles that generated significant debate over ethics and press freedom. The publication led to a legal dispute that reached the Supreme Court, and in 1972, the Times won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for this coverage. This revelation not only raised questions about governmental powers, but also strengthened the public's right to information. At Travis Air Force Base in Fairfield, California, an emotional reunion took place. Lieutenant Colonel Robert L. Sturm, who had been held as a prisoner of war, returned home. He was one of many prisoners of war who endured years of captivity and torture in harsh conditions before being finally released. The negotiations that led to the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in 1973 included the release of American prisoners, part of the reconciliation process. A large anti-war demonstration took place in Washington in front of the Lincoln Memorial. This event brought together thousands of people who opposed the conflict and demanded an end to military involvement in Vietnam. The demonstrators from all parts of the country carried signs and banners with messages of peace and anti-war slogans. And the demonstration included speeches by peace movement leaders, civil rights activists, war veterans, students, and other concerned citizens. Hamburger Hill was the name given to a fierce battle that took place in the A Shau Mountains near the border with Laos. Between May 10th and May 20th, 1969, United States and South Vietnamese forces faced the North Vietnamese Army. This fight was marked by its extreme difficulty and high number of casualties. American military faced severe challenges in capturing the heavily fortified hill. Despite the victory, controversy arose due to the high number of casualties compared to the questionable strategic value of the hill. General Creighton Abrams played a crucial role during the war by leading the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MMACV. The MACV was responsible for coordinating U.S. military and strategic support for the South Vietnamese government and armed forces. Creighton Abrams took command of the MACV in 1968, succeeding General William Westmoreland. Under his leadership, the strategic approach in Vietnam underwent significant adjustments. Abrams focused on implementing the policy of Vietnamization and a more integrated strategy, combining military operations with efforts to improve local security and gain civilian support. Women and children often found themselves in extremely dangerous situations, seeking shelter during attacks. A particularly poignant example occurred in Bao Tri, an area near Saigon, where civilians tried to protect themselves amidst the chaos of combat. Women and children, being the most vulnerable during attacks, sought shelter wherever available, often in makeshift trenches, basements, or partially destroyed structures. Peace demonstrators gathered in Central Park, New York, to protest against the conflict. In a symbolic and impactful act, a group of demonstrators stood out for burning their draft cards. Using a coffee can filled with sand soaked in lighter fluid, they set fire to the cards, demonstrating their opposition to the war and the draft. They saw the conflict as unjust and unnecessary, and many believed that American intervention in Vietnam was not only failing in its objectives, but also causing disproportionate suffering and destruction. The act of burning draft cards was illegal and risky, as participants faced possible legal consequences, including imprisonment. However, for many, the gesture was a declaration of principle and a call to action for others who also opposed the war. Presidential advisor Dr. Henry Kissinger and North Vietnam's chief negotiator Le Duc Tho met for crucial discussions. This meeting was part of a series of secret negotiations aimed at ending the war, which culminated in the Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, leading to the withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam and marking the beginning of the end of the nearly two-decade conflict. The negotiation process was complex and involved many discussions on issues such as ceasefire, prisoner exchange, and Vietnam's political future. During the final phase of the conflict, American sailors aboard the USS Blue Ridge carried out desperate actions to evacuate Saigon. With the city about to be captured by communist troops, a large-scale evacuation operation was conducted to remove American citizens and Vietnamese allies. On the USS Blue Ridge, anchored off the coast of Vietnam, sailors pushed a helicopter into the sea to clear space on the flight deck for more evacuation aircraft. This dramatic action was part of Operation Frequent Wind, the last phase of the American evacuation of Saigon. The situation was chaotic, with helicopters arriving continuously, loaded with people fleeing the imminent capture of the city. The evacuation of the United States Embassy in Saigon, known as the Fall of Saigon, marked the end of the conflict in Vietnam and the complete control of South Vietnam by North Vietnamese forces. During the evacuation, the embassy's helicopter zone became the critical point where American helicopters conducted a frantic operation to evacuate military and diplomatic personnel, as well as many Vietnamese civilians at risk. Operation Frequent Wind was the largest helicopter evacuation in history. Crowds of desperate Vietnamese, fearing reprisals and seeking to escape the conflict, scaled the walls of the United States Embassy. They feared for their safety and future under the new regime and tried to reach the helicopters evacuating Americans and some Vietnamese. This scene occurred in the chaotic end of the war and was part of Operation Frequent Wind. On April 30, 1975, the presidential palace was taken by a North Vietnamese tank, symbolizing the end of the Long War and the Communist North's victory over the South. The image of this tank crossing the palace gates became known worldwide and is remembered both for the reunification of Vietnam under a communist government and for the deep scars and global repercussions of the war. In April 1975, the provincial capital of Xuan Loc, located 35 miles north of Saigon, was the scene of a battle in the final phase of the war. South Vietnamese commander Le Minh Dao faced an imminent siege by a massive North Vietnamese force. General Dao sent a helicopter to Saigon to fetch reinforcements and evacuees, but the helicopter ended up leaving the passengers outside the city. Neither the evacuees nor General Dao expected the communist forces to advance and encircle Xuan Loc so quickly and completely. An American Army helicopter used to capture and transport Viet Cong prisoners. These aircraft played an important role in the conflict, allowing the rapid insertion and extraction of troops, supply delivery, and evacuation of the wounded and prisoners. The capture of Viet Cong prisoners during search and destroy operations was a common practice, with helicopters facilitating movement through the difficult Vietnamese terrain. An American soldier with the phrase, "War is hell," on his helmet, a symbol of many people's view of the brutality of the conflict. Millions of Vietnamese, both combatants and civilians, lost their lives, and American forces suffered tens of thousands of casualties. The physical and emotional scars left by the conflict affected entire generations. 1st Cavalry Division medic Thomas Cole, from Richmond, Virginia, was photographed treating Sergeant Harrison Pell, who was wounded during a firefight between American troops and a combined North Vietnamese and Viet Cong force. Cole was looking up with one eye uncovered, focused on treating the wounded soldier amid the chaos of combat. Military medics risked their lives to save their comrades in extremely dangerous conditions. The photo taken in Binh Dinh Province, South Vietnam, shows wounded members of the 1st Air Cavalry being rescued and transported to a hospital after intense gunfire. Binh Dinh Province was an area of intense military activity, with frequent clashes. The difficult terrain and the presence of well-entrenched enemy forces made military operations particularly challenging and dangerous. A wounded paratrooper of the 101st Airborne Division being helped by 2 medics during a blinding storm after being evacuated from Dong Ap Bia during the 10-day battle for Hamburger Hill. The informal name given to Hill, 937 in Dong Ap Bia, was the scene of fierce fighting between American and South Vietnamese forces and North Vietnamese Communist forces. The battle was notorious for the intense resistance of Communist defenders, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides. American Marines advance up a hill in an area that battalion leaders already considered safe. Carrying heavy equipment, including multiple water containers, these Marines faced difficult combat conditions in challenging terrain. Water was a vital resource for the soldiers' survival, especially in the hot and humid conditions of Vietnam. Besides water containers, the Marines carried weapons, ammunition, and other essential equipment for their operations. The need to transport heavy supplies made the advance even more exhausting, but was crucial to maintaining combat capability and troop survival. On Hill 742, located in Vietnam, 5 miles northwest of Doc To, soldiers faced brutal combat for control of this strategic area. The Battle of Doc To was one of the most brutal of the war, due to the steep and densely forested terrain which favored the guerrilla tactics of Communist defenders. American soldiers faced extremely challenging conditions, including heavy artillery fire, ambushes, and traps. An American paramedic carrying a wounded child away from the battle in Hue. The child was found wandering between North Vietnamese and American firing lines the previous night. The paramedic, risking his own safety, took the child to a safe place where she could receive the necessary care. A rare occasion to show the true value of human kindness and dignity. During the Vietnam War, U.S. Secretary of Defense Melvin R. Laird visited South Vietnam, accompanied by General Creighton W. Abrams, commander of U.S. forces in the region, and American Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker. During this visit, Laird commented on the ongoing Communist offensive, describing it as a deliberate increase in conflicts. Laird noted that although there was a cessation of rocket attacks on Saigon, this pause had no great strategic significance. He emphasized that the temporary absence of attacks did not indicate a decrease in the intensity of the conflict, but rather a change in enemy tactics. The presence of Laird, Abrams, and Bunker in South Vietnam underscored the complexity of the Vietnamese conflict and the need for coordination between military and diplomatic efforts. Marines in an operation southwest of Phu Bai, where they were photographed atop an M48 tank as the 90 mm cannon fired. This scene occurred during a road sweep, a common operation aimed at locating and neutralizing ambushes and improvised explosive devices, IEDs, placed by the Viet Cong. The Marines, positioned on top of the M48 tank, covered their ears due to the deafening roar of the shot. The M48 Patton was a central piece of the United States armored arsenal, offering great firepower and protection for troops in combat operations. In the city of Wakefield, Massachusetts, a demonstration took place in support of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam conflict. The event was planned by Paul P. Christopher, a 19-year-old student who was troubled by the frequent anti-war protests and wanted to express his support for American policies. The participants believed that American involvement in the war was necessary to combat the expansion of communism and defend freedom and democracy in Southeast Asia. The demonstrators emphasized the importance of supporting the American troops serving in Vietnam, many of whom were young, like Paul Christopher. President Richard Nixon, on a visit to the 1st Infantry Division headquarters, located in Di An, 12 miles north of Saigon. This visit was a show of support for the troops involved in the conflict and an effort to boost soldiers' morale. Vietnamese guerrilla Nguyen Van Lim being summarily executed by General Nguyen Ngoc Loan in Saigon, South Vietnam, on February 1, 1968. Captured during the Tet Offensive, the image became a powerful symbol of the brutality of the Vietnam conflict. The public execution, carried out in broad daylight, shocked the world and highlighted the extreme violence present in the conflict. This event had a profound impact on global public opinion, intensifying criticism of the war and influencing sentiment against United States military involvement in Vietnam. A Viet Cong hideout being emptied after being destroyed by American and Vietnamese soldiers in Vietnam in 1964. Captured during the early years of the Vietnam War, the photo reveals the destruction of one of the many underground bases used by the Viet Cong to conduct their guerrilla operations. These hideouts were crucial to the asymmetric warfare tactics employed by the Viet Cong fighters. The destruction of such bases marked a significant attempt by Allied forces to destabilize enemy operations. American soldiers of the 7th Marine Regiment marching along a dirt road in Cape Batangan, Vietnam, in 1965. 2 tanks passed beside them, symbolizing the heavy support and robust military presence of the United States in the region. Captured during the escalation of the Vietnam War, the image shows the constant movement and mobilization of troops in ground operations.